The Sterling estate sat like a grim fortress atop the rocky cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island. For over 2 centuries, its gray granite walls and towering oak trees had shielded the family from the prying eyes of the world. To the public, the Sterlings were the epitome of New England aristocracy philanthropists, titans of the shipping industry, and keepers of an untarnished legacy. To me, however, the estate was nothing more than a beautifully gilded cage, and I was the stray animal they had brought inside solely to bleed. I was 10 years old when Arthur and Eleanor Sterling adopted me from a damp, underfunded orphanage in Boston. I remember the day vividly. Eleanor had looked at me with an intensity that I mistakenly chose to believe was maternal love. Arthur had patted my shoulder with a cold, firm grip, declaring that I would now bear the prestigious Sterling name. They renamed me Julian. For the first few months, I thought I had been saved by angels. I was given a room in the East Wing, fine tailored clothes, and tutors who taught me how to speak like royalty. But the illusion shattered on a Tuesday evening in the grand dining room. I was sitting at the long mahogany table, nervously cutting my steak, when Julian, their biological son, and the golden hair of the family suddenly collapsed. His glass of milk shattered against the floor, and his face turned a terrifying, sickly pale. The mansion erupted into chaos. Doctors arrived in private ambulances, their faces grim. Within 48 hours, the truth of my existence in that house was laid bare. Julian had been diagnosed with an aggressive, rare form of acute myeloid leukemia. His body was failing, and his heavily damaged bone marrow needed an immediate transplant. Because of his rare blood type and specific genetic markers, finding a public donor was nearly impossible, and time was running out. I sat in the corner of Arthur's private study, trembling, as I overheard the conversation between my adoptive parents and the family physician, Dr. Halloway. The boy's records from the orphanage are a perfect match, Arthur, Dr. Halloway whispered, his voice carrying a clinical chill. His tissue type, his HLA marker sits a 1 in million medical alignment. It's almost as if he was tailor-made for Julian. Eleanor didn't cry for joy. She didn't thank God for a miracle. She simply exhaled a cold sigh of relief, her eyes narrowing as she looked through the cracked door straight at me. Then the adoption served its purpose. Prepare the operating rooms immediately. I want my saved. That night, I realized the horrifying truth. I hadn't been adopted because they wanted a second son. I hadn't been chosen because of my bright eyes or my quiet demeanor. I was adopted because I was a walking, breathing medical reservoir. I was an insurance policy bought from an orphanage, a biological spare part wrapped in an expensive Sterling name tag. The next morning, I was brought into the private wing of the local hospital. The contrast between how they treated us was brutal. Julian lay in a lavish, sunlit room surrounded by stuffed animals, flowers, and a distraught Eleanor who held his hand, whispering promises of a bright future. I was placed in a sterile, windowless room down the hall, prepped by nurses who looked at me with pity but said nothing. Arthur stood by my bedside, not to comfort me, but to ensure I didn't run away. "You are doing a great thing for this family, boy," Arthur said, his voice void of any paternal warmth. "Remember your place. You owe us your life. This is how you pay the debt." When the anesthesia began to pump into my veins, looking up at the harsh, blinding surgical lights, I didn't feel fear. I felt a profound, freezing numbness. As darkness took over my mind, I made a silent vow to myself. If I survived this, if my body could endure the physical violation of being emptied for their golden child, I would one day make them pay. I would grow, I would watch, and I would wait until the day the Sterling Empire crumbled, just so I could be the one to push the final brick. The extraction of bone marrow from a child's hip is a brutal, agonizing process. For weeks after the surgery, my lower body felt as though it were filled with shattered glass. Every step was a battle against a blinding, throbbing pain. Yet, while the fourth-floor wing of the Newport Hospital celebrated the miraculous recovery of Julian Sterling, my recovery was treated as a minor inconvenience. I was discharged early, sent back to the estate in the back of a staff vehicle, and told to rest in my room out of sight. Julian, the golden hair, returned home a month later to a hero's welcome. The mansion was filled with banners, laughter, and the clinking of fine crystal. My adoptive parents throwing a grand gala to celebrate his health, but my name was never mentioned to the guests. I was kept in the East Wing, a ghost haunting the edges of their perfect family portrait. My purpose had been fulfilled. The spare part had been harvested, and the machine was running smoothly once more. 5 years passed in that suffocating silence. I grew taller, my eyes hardening into two chips of flint. I studied obsessively, devouring every book on finance, corporate law, and logistics in Arthur's library whenever he was away on business. I learned how the Sterling family made their millions, and more importantly, I began to notice where the cracks in their foundations lay. But I kept my head down, playing the role of the quiet, grateful adopted son. The hammer finally dropped on the eve of my 16th birthday. I was called into Arthur's private study. The room smelled of expensive cigars and old leather. Arthur sat behind his desk, his expression cold and clinical, while Eleanor stood by the window, her back turned to me. Between them on the desk sat a single, small black leather suitcase and a piece of paper. "Sit down, Julian," Arthur said, though he didn't look at me. He was busy unscrewing the cap of his fountain pen. I sat in the leather chair, my posture straight, my face completely unreadable. "Yes, father." "Don't call me that." Eleanor's voice cut through the room like a whip. She turned around, her eyes devoid of even the faked warmth she used to wear. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries. You are 16 now. The legal obligations of your adoption have been restructured." Arthur slid the piece of paper toward me. It was a voluntary relinquishment of the Sterling name, along with a non-disclosure agreement regarding my medical history with the family. "Julian's health is now completely stable," Arthur explained, his tone as detached as a judge delivering a routine verdict. "He is preparing to enter Harvard next year to take over the family legacy. Your presence in this house, frankly, is a complication we no longer wish to manage. You were brought here for a specific medical necessity. That necessity is over." I looked at the document, then up at Arthur. "You are throwing me out." "We are releasing you," Eleanor corrected haughtily. "Arthur has graciously set up a trust account for you. There is $50,000 in it. It is more than enough for a boy from your background to find a small apartment and finish trade school. You should be grateful we didn't send you back to the orphanage with nothing." $50,000, the price of a single watch on Arthur's wrist. That was the value they placed on my blood, my pain, and 6 years of my life. "Sign the papers, take the suitcase, and a driver will take you to the train station," Arthur said, tapping his pen against the desk. "From this moment on, you are no longer a Sterling. You do not contact us. You do not speak of us. You disappear." I looked at the pen in his hand. A normal 16-year-old would have cried, begged, or screamed at the injustice of it all. But I didn't. I felt a familiar, freezing calm wash over me. The vow I had made under the surgical lights 6 years ago burned bright in my chest. I picked up the pen and signed the document without a single word. My handwriting was sharp, elegant, and entirely steady. I stood up, gripped the handle of the small black suitcase, and looked at the two monsters who had used me like an animal. "Thank you for the education," I said softly, my voice laced with a quiet, terrifying confidence that made Arthur's hand freeze for a fraction of a second. I turned on my heel and walked out of the study. As I stepped out of the heavy front doors of the Sterling estate, a fierce New England rain began to fall, drenching my clothes within seconds. I didn't look back at the mansion. I walked down the long, winding driveway toward the iron gates, the cold water washing away the last remnants of the boy they had broken. Julian Sterling was dead. The man who would destroy them had just been born. 15 years is a long time for an empire to rot, but it is the perfect amount of time to build a ghost. I no longer went by Julian. I had reclaimed my birth name, Leo, and spent the last decade and a half clawing my way up through the brutal, unforgiving world of private equity. The $50,000 the Sterlings had thrown at me to disappear had been aggressively multiplied, reinvested, and used to fund an education they never wanted me to have. By 30, I was the managing director of Vane Capital, a predatory sovereign fund that specialized in buying distressed corporate giants, stripping them to the bone, and selling the pieces. I had become a master at spotting weakness. And the Sterling family was bleeding out. From my glass-walled office in Boston, I kept a meticulous, multi-layered file on the family that had discarded me. The downfall hadn't been caused by an outside enemy. It had come from the very golden child they had sacrificed my body to save, Julian Sterling. After graduating from Harvard, a degree Arthur had essentially bought with a massive donation, Julian had taken over the reins of Sterling Logistics. He possessed all of his father's arrogance, but none of his caution. Julian wanted to prove he was a visionary, a modern titan. Instead, he became a reckless gambler in a tailored suit. 3 years ago, Julian had invested heavily in a high-risk maritime expansion project in the Pacific, funding it entirely through massive, high-interest loans leveraged against the Sterling estate and the family's core shipping fleet. The project collapsed within 8 months due to structural mismanagement and supply chain failures. To cover the bleeding, Julian had secretly dipped into the company's pension funds and signed a series of predatory secondary financing agreements with a group of aggressive lenders. He thought he was being clever, hiding the losses behind creative accounting, but I had been tracking every single shell corporation he interacted with. In fact, through a network of anonymous proxies, Bain Capital had quietly bought up 80% of the Sterling's outstanding secondary debt. I didn't just own their loans, I owned their throat. Yesterday, the final blow landed. A major federal audit was announced into Sterling Logistics' financial records. The panic in the Newport mansion must have been palpable. The family was facing total public bankruptcy, and Julian was staring down the barrel of a federal prison sentence for corporate embezzlement. I leaned back in my chair, looking at a recent photograph of the family printed in a business magazine. Arthur looked frail, his hair entirely white, the weight of his failing legacy crushing his shoulders. Eleanor looked hollow, her plastic surgery-tightened face unable to hide the terror in her eyes, and Julian, the miracle boy, looked broken. The time for waiting was over. The rot had reached the foundation. I pressed the intercom on my desk. Sarah, call the legal representatives of Sterling Logistics. Tell them Bain Capital is prepared to buy out their entire debt portfolio, clear Julian's immediate legal liabilities, and purchase the ancestral estate in Newport. But tell them the offer is only valid if the principal family members sign the agreement in person at our Boston headquarters tomorrow morning. Understood, Mr. Vance, my secretary replied. And what name should I give them for the signing principal? I looked down at the scar on my hip, a faded, silver reminder of the night they emptied my bones to save their future. Tell them they will be meeting with the chairman, I said softly. They don't need a name, they just need to bring their pens. The boardrooms of Bain Capital were designed to intimidate. Located on the highest floor of our Boston Tower, the room was a minimalist expanse of black steel, smoked glass, and a massive slate table that felt more like an altar than a desk. The temperature was kept intentionally low. It forced people to shiver, to feel vulnerable before the negotiations even began. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the heavy glass doors slid open, and the remnants of the Sterling dynasty walked in. Arthur led the way, leaning heavily on a silver-topped cane. His posture, once commanding and rigid, was now bowed by the weight of absolute defeat. Behind him was Eleanor, her eyes swollen behind a pair of large designer sunglasses, clutching her Hermes bag like a life preserver. And finally, trailing behind them like a ghost, was Julian. He looked completely unraveled. His tie was loosened, his hair messy, and his hands twitched nervously at his sides. The golden boy was staring into the abyss of a 20-year prison sentence, and he knew it. They were accompanied by a team of 3 exhausted corporate lawyers, all carrying thick leather briefcases filled with the wreckage of Sterling Logistics. Welcome, Sarah, my executive assistant, said with a polite, clinical smile. Please take a seat. The chairman will be with you shortly. Arthur sank into the leather chair, letting out a ragged sigh. He placed his hands on the slate table, looking across at the empty seat at the head of the boardroom. Where is he? We were told the wire transfers to clear our immediate federal liabilities would be initiated the moment we arrived. Every minute we waste, the SEC gets closer to freezing our remaining personal assets. The documents are ready for your review, Mr. Sterling, the lead lawyer from Bain Capital replied, sliding a thick stack of papers across the matte black surface. The terms remain unchanged. Bain Capital will absorb the $80 million in predatory debt, assume all legal liabilities regarding the pension fund discrepancy, and grant Julian Sterling full immunity from the pending corporate fraud charges. Julian let out a sharp, choked breath of relief, burying his face in his hands. Thank God, he muttered. However, the vain lawyer continued, his voice completely void of emotion. In exchange, you will sign over 100% of your remaining shares in Sterling Logistics, surrender all intellectual property, and legally transfer the deed of the Sterling estate in Newport to our principal's private holding company. You will leave this room with nothing but your personal effects. Eleanor slammed her hand against the table, her voice trembling with indignant rage. Our family home? 2 centuries of history. You are stripping us of our entire lives. Who is this anonymous buyer? What kind of monster hides behind a corporate shield to rob a family in their darkest hour? It's not robbery, Mrs. Sterling, the lawyer replied calmly. It's a liquidation. You have no cards left to play. Either you sign, or your son is arrested by federal marshals before the market closes today. Arthur looked at Julian, his old eyes filled with a mixture of disgust and desperate paternal protection. He had sacrificed everything to keep his biological bloodline intact, and now he had to sign away the empire just to keep his son out of an orange jumpsuit. "Give me the pen," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. "Let's get this over with. Just tell your chairman that he has successfully destroyed the Sterling legacy." "Destroyed it?" A smooth, deep voice echoed from the doorway. The glass door slid open silently. I stepped into the room, wearing a bespoke midnight blue suit, my posture perfectly erect, my face a mask of absolute, unyielding power. I walked slowly toward the head of the table, my eyes locking dead onto Arthur's frail form. Arthur froze. Eleanor's jaw dropped, her sunglasses slipping down the bridge of her nose. Julian looked up from his hands, his eyes widening in a slow, horrified realization as he looked at the face that resembled his own in a strange, twisted way. "No," Eleanor whispered, her face turning a sickly, translucent white. "It can't be." I sat down at the head of the table, leaning back in the plush leather chair, looking at the 3 monsters who had discarded me 15 years ago. "Hello, Mother. Hello, Father," I said, my voice cutting through the freezing air of the boardroom like a razor blade. "I believe you've been waiting for me." The silence in the boardroom was absolute, so dense it felt heavy. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the low hum of the tower's climate control system. Arthur looked at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The silver-topped cane in his hand began to rattle against the leg of the slate table. "Julian?" Arthur finally choked out, using the name they had stolen from an orphanage and then stripped away from me in his study 15 years ago. You're the chairman of Vane Capital?" "My name is Leo," I said, my voice dangerously calm, devoid of any anger. "Leo Vance. The name Julian belongs to the man sitting to your left, the one who ruined you." Julian looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and deep, primitive shame. He pulled his hands back from the table, tucking them into his lap as if trying to shrink away from my gaze. He remembered the boy whose hip had been drilled to save his life, the ghost who used to sit in the shadow of the East Wing. He just never expected that ghost to return with $1 billion fund behind him. "You?" Eleanor pointed a shaking, manicured finger at me. Her aristocratic poise had completely vanished, replaced by the raw, ugly panic of a cornered animal. "This is a setup. You did this. You manipulated the market. You targeted our shipping lines. This whole bankruptcy is an act of malice." I leaned forward, placing my forearms on the black slate table. I looked directly into her frantic eyes. "I didn't have to touch your market, Eleanor. I didn't spend a single dollar trying to sabotage your company. I simply sat in this chair, watched your golden boy make one reckless, arrogant mistake after another, and bought up the debt he was too foolish to manage. I didn't destroy the Sterlings. You did that the day you raised a fool and called him a king." "Leo, please," Arthur whispered, his voice suddenly sounding incredibly old, stripped of all the transactional authority he had used to rule his family. He leaned across the table, his eyes pleading. "We did what we had to do back then. Julian was dying. The family line was at stake. You were a child from an orphanage. We gave you a home. We gave you a chance. You gave me a knife in my hip and a $50,000 ticket to oblivion." I replied, the words falling like blocks of ice. "Do not speak to me of debt, Arthur. My debt to this family was paid in full under the surgical lights of Newport Hospital. Tonight, we are here to settle yours." The Sterling lawyers looked back and forth between us, completely bewildered by the sudden unearthing of a decades-old family horror. The lead attorney nervously cleared his throat, sliding the paperwork closer to Arthur. "Mr. Sterling, the market closes in less than 3 hours. If these deeds and share transfers are not executed immediately, Vane Capital's wire transfers will be withheld. The federal marshals are already waiting at your logistics headquarters." Arthur looked down at the pen in his hand. It looked heavier than his iron cane. His legacy, his ancestral home, the name his great-grandfather had carved into the history of Rhode Island. All of it was balanced on the tip of a fountain pen held by the boy he had exiled. "If I sign this," Arthur said, his voice trembling, looking up at me with a desperate, broken hope, "will you save him? Will you keep Julian out of prison?" I looked at Julian, whose face was wet with tears of absolute cowardice, then back at Arthur. "Sign the papers, Arthur," I said softly, a dark, hidden smile playing at the edge of my lips. "And I promise you, Julian will get exactly what he deserves." Arthur closed his eyes, a single tear cutting through the deep wrinkles of his face. He lowered the pen to the paper and began to sign away the Sterling Empire, completely unaware that the trap I had built for them hadn't even sprung yet. Chapter 6. The paper trail. Arthur's hand shook violently as he finished signing the final deed, transferring the keys of the Newport estate to Vane Capital. He dropped the pen. It rolled across the matte black slate table, stopping right in front of me. "It's done," Arthur whispered, burying his face in his weathered hands. "Everything we built, everything we owned, it's yours. Now execute the wire transfers, clear the legal liabilities, and save my son." I didn't reach for the signed documents. Instead, I opened the sleek leather folder sitting right in front of me and pulled out a thick, faded medical file bound by a rusted steel clip. The label on the front read, "Newport Memorial Hospital, Patient Archive, 2011. "The wire transfers are already being processed, Arthur," I said, my voice echoing with a terrifyingly quiet authority. "Julian won't go to prison for corporate embezzlement. The Sterling Logistics debt is cleared, but as I said, tonight we are settling all debts. And there is one more file we need to review before you leave my tower." Eleanor squinted at the faded folder, a sudden look of sharp, defensive panic flashing across her tight face. "What is that?" "We already signed the non-disclosure agreements regarding your medical donation 15 years ago. You legally cannot bring this up." "This isn't about my donation, Eleanor," I said, sliding the folder across the table. It slid smoothly over the slate, coming to a stop directly under Arthur's trembling hands. "Open it." Arthur hesitantly pulled the folder open. Inside were two separate DNA profile sheets, a series of neonatal medical records, and an official letter bearing the embossed seal of a private forensic laboratory. As his eyes scanned the clinical charts and genetic percentages, the remaining color drained from his face. His breath hitched, turning into a choked, ragged gasp. "What? What is the meaning of this?" Arthur stammered, his head snapping up to look at his wife. "Eleanor, what did you do?" Eleanor reached over, snatching the papers from his grip. The moment her eyes hit the forensic letter, her mouth fell open in an unvoiced scream. She dropped the papers as if they were covered in acid, her hands shaking so hard she knocked over her glass of water. 15 years ago, you two walked into an orphanage in Boston looking for a perfect biological match for your sick son," I said, leaning forward, my gaze pinning Eleanor to her chair. "Dr. Holloway told you it was a 1 in a million miracle alignment. He told you my tissue types and HLA markers were so perfectly identical to Julian's that it was almost as if I was tailor-made to be his donor." I paused, letting the suffocating cold of the room sink into their skin. "But science doesn't believe in 1 in a million miracles, Arthur," I continued, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. "I spent the last 5 years tracing the paper trail. I tracked down the retired nurse who handled Julian's birth at the private clinic in Boston. I dug up the audited medical logs that Dr. Holloway tried so desperately to incinerate before he died." Julian looked up from his lap, his eyes darting frantically between his parents and the scattered papers. "Father? Mother? What is happening? What do the papers say?" Arthur didn't look at his golden boy. He was staring at his wife with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. "The records show a very specific medical anomaly, Arthur," I said, pointing a finger at the genetic charts. "Julian's bone marrow was failing because of a congenital, hereditary defect. A defect that can only be cured by a transplant from an identical twin or a sibling with a 100% direct parental genetic match. An orphanage stranger could never have saved his life." I leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, watching Eleanor slide down into her seat, her aristocratic mask completely shattered into jagged pieces. "I wasn't a stranger, Arthur," I said softly, the words landing like a heavy executioner's axe. "And I wasn't just a spare part you bought from the streets. The paper trail proves everything. Eleanor knew it. Dr. Holloway knew it. And tonight, the world is going to find out. The boardroom felt as cold as a crypt. Arthur stared at the genetic reports, his chest heaving as he tried to process the black and ink evidence before him. He turned his head slowly toward Eleanor, his voice a ragged, broken whisper. Eleanor, look at me. Look at me and tell me this is a lie. Eleanor couldn't look at him. She buried her face in her trembling hands, her shoulders shaking violently as a muffled, desperate sob escaped her lips. Her silence was the loudest confession she could have ever given. I'll tell you the story, Arthur, since your wife lacks the courage to do so, I said, my voice cutting through the room with clinical precision. 31 years ago, Eleanor gave birth to twin boys at the St. Jude private clinic in Boston. But there was a complication, a scandal that would have destroyed the pristine reputation of the sterling name. Julian looked back and forth between us, his breathing shallow. Twins? What do you mean twins? I don't have a twin. You did, Julian, I said, turning my cold gaze toward him. Me. But when we were born, Eleanor was desperate to hide a dark truth. You see, Arthur, you were away in Europe for 6 months managing the shipping lines. During that time, Eleanor had an affair. When the twins were born premature, the medical tests revealed a devastating reality. One boy carried your direct bloodline, Arthur. The other boy, the one carrying the congenital bone marrow defect, belonged to her lover. Arthur gripped his silver-top cane so hard his knuckles turned white. His eyes locked onto the neonatal blood type records in the folder. Dr. Halloway was deeply in debt to our family's firm back then, I continued, leaning forward. Eleanor paid him $500,000 to orchestrate a switch. She wanted to keep the sterling fortune intact, but she couldn't risk you finding out about the affair through a routine blood test if the sickly child failed, so they made a choice. They took me, the healthy, legitimate biological son of Arthur Sterling, and secretly registered me as an abandoned child, dropping me off at the Boston orphanage. They kept you, Julian, the illegitimate child of an affair, raised on sterling money, dressed in sterling clothes, and crowned as the heir to an empire that never belonged to his blood. No, no, that's impossible, Julian screamed, standing up so fast his chair flew backward against the glass wall. I am a Sterling. I went to Harvard. This company is mine. Father, tell him he's crazy. Tell him he's lying. But Arthur didn't move. He looked at the DNA profile sheets. The genetic markers on my report matched his own with a staggering 99.9% accuracy. The markers on Julian's report showed absolutely no paternal relation to Arthur Sterling. The realization hit Arthur like a physical blow. The son he had doted on, the son he had bought a Harvard degree for, the son he had ruined his company to protect was the product of his wife's betrayal. And the boy he had locked in a dark room, drilled for bone marrow, and thrown out onto the streets like trash with a $50,000 check, was his true, legitimate flesh and blood. My God, Arthur choked out, a thick, agonizing tear rolling down his wrinkled cheek as he looked at me. He reached out a trembling hand across the table, his voice cracking with a decade of accumulated guilt. Leo, my son, I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know. I know you didn't, Arthur, I said, my face remaining an unreadable mask of stone as I slowly pulled the signed deeds and corporate contracts toward my side of the table. But ignorance doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't erase the scars on my hip, and it doesn't erase the 15 years I spent surviving in the dark while a parasite wore my clothes and lived my life. I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket, looking down at the broken remnants of the family that had discarded me. The wire transfers have cleared, Arthur. Your debt to the banks is paid, I said softly, picking up the folder. But the Sterling name, the logistics company, and the Newport estate, they aren't yours to give away anymore. They are finally returning to their rightful owner. The finality of the truth settled over the room like a heavy shroud. Julian stood frozen against the glass wall, his hands clawing at his chest as if trying to rip away the designer clothes that suddenly felt like a stolen uniform. He looked at Eleanor, who was collapsed over the table, her quiet sobs the only sound left in the towering fortress of Vane Capital. Julian, Arthur said, his voice no longer shaking. It had gone completely flat, hollowed out by an absolute, freezing desolation. He didn't look at the boy he had raised. He kept his eyes fixed on the matte black slate table. Take your mother. Get out of my sight. Father, please, Julian begged, stepping forward, his knees buckling. I didn't know. I'm your son. I've always been your son. You are a thief living in a dead man's house, Arthur whispered, finally turning his head to look at Julian, his eyes filled with a terrifying, silent fury. You have squandered my fortune, ruined my name, and you do not carry a single drop of my blood. Leave. The Vane Capital's security guards stepped into the room, their expressions clinical and unyielding. They fliked their hands toward the exit, silently commanding them to move. Eleanor slowly stood up, her face ruined by tears, and grabbed Julian's arm. Together, the disgraced mother and the false heir stumbled out of the boardroom, their frantic footsteps echoing down the long marble corridor until the glass doors slid shut behind them, sealing them out forever. Only Arthur remained, slumped in his chair at the far end of the long table. He looked at me, his old eyes wide with a desperate, pleading agony. He was a man who had traded his soul for a legacy, only to realize he had thrown away the true heir to save a parasite. Leo, Arthur croaked, his hands reaching across the cold slate toward me. Please, come back to Newport. The estate is yours. The name is yours. Let me make this right. I have a few years left. Let me give you the life you were supposed to have. I looked down at his outstretched hands. I felt no anger. I felt no hatred. I only felt the vast, empty space of a vow that had finally been fulfilled. You can't give me a life, Arthur, I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and completely detached. I built my own. The life you want to offer me is a graveyard of old money and secrets. I have no interest in sitting among the ruins of your past. But the sterling name, Arthur wept, his shoulders shaking. It dies with me. Then let it die, I replied, picking up the signed deeds and corporate contracts, sliding them into my leather briefcase. The logistics company will be rebranded under Vane Capital by tomorrow morning. The Newport mansion will be gutted, modernized, and turned into a private rehabilitation center for orphans who actually need a home. I am keeping the birthright you stole from me, but I am leaving the curse behind. I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my bespoke suit. I walked to the head of the table and looked out the massive glass window. Below us, the city of Boston was waking up, a sprawling grid of endless possibility, entirely indifferent to the ancient drama that had just unfolded on the 65th floor. Your lawyers will arrange a small apartment for you in Connecticut, funded by a private stipend from my firm, I said, not turning back to look at him. It is far more than the $50,000 you gave me when you threw me out in the rain. Consider the debt settled. Arthur didn't argue. He slowly gripped his silver-topped cane, pushed himself out of the chair, and walked toward the exit with the slow, heavy steps of a man who knew he was walking into a permanent exile. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind him with a soft, final click. I stood alone in the quiet boardroom, the morning sun finally breaking through the gray New England clouds, casting long, sharp shadows across the black slate. I reached down, placing my hand over my hip, feeling the faint, raised line of the scar through the fabric of my trousers. The pain was gone. The ledger was clear. For 15 years, I had been the stone that the builders rejected, a secret harvested in the dark and cast out into the cold. But the builders had failed, their foundation had crumbled, and from the dust of their empire, I had built a kingdom of my own. I took a deep breath of the sterile